Welcome back to our series Colonizer Exposed. I'm your host, Stephanie, and today we're going to do part 2 of Colonizer Exposed USA. In part 1, we discussed America's manifest destiny, aka everything in America belongs to white people. And in part 2, we're going to talk about America's colonies, aka territories. In the words of Barack Obama, if you put lipstick on a pig, it's still a pig. So, speaking of our dear Barack, we are going to start with the state of Hawaii. Indigenous Hawaiians lived on their Paradise Archipelago for approximately 1,500 years without any interference from colonizers. But as we have seen with this series, when people mind their business, colonizers tend to come in. With strong Polynesian roots, the Hawaiian maritime culture is similar to other indigenous cultures in that it focused on nature preservation, communing with nature, taking care of everything around you, aka the opposite of capitalistic colonization, and close familial bonds. And like yoga to the Indians, hula was actually a revered spiritual practice practiced by native Hawaiians that has now been turned into tourist fodder. So, about those colonizers. In approximately 1778, the British Captain Cook did what the colonizers of the day did, explored around, got lost, and discovered Hawaii, New Zealand. Friendly at first, Captain Cook told everyone in Europe that he had found a new paradise. However, as you know, is on par for the task, his friendly nature then changed quickly and he decided that he was going to try and detain a Hawaiian chief, to which he was murdered in 1779. Karma comes quick. Now, in keeping with the manifest destiny theme that we talked about in the last episode, America set its sights on Hawaii. America's first line of defense was to send the missionaries. Yes, we should probably talk about the fact that religion has been used historically to deprive Native people of their lands, civilize Native people, and overall just kind of ruin everything. Over 100 friendly American missionaries were sent to Hawaii. You know their mandate: civilize, colonize, steal culture, blah, blah, blah. It's really getting old, huh? However, America's manifest destiny was blocked by one large institution, and that was the Kingdom of Hawaii, the monarchy that ruled over Hawaii at the time. In 1810, King Kamehameha became the first ruler of Hawaii. Not to be deterred though, America, after sending in their missionaries, left it to the shrewd businessmen and sent in a bunch of businessmen who then decided to set up a pseudo-plantocracy. These businessmen then built sugar plantations along with European businessmen who were doing the same thing. If there's one thing a colonizer knows how to do, it's avoid labor. Fast forward to 1893, and the then current ruler of Hawaii, Queen Liliuokalani, decided that she wanted to ensure that only Native Hawaiians could vote, seeing as there were colonizers in her land telling her and everyone else what to do. The colonizers then took that as a direct jab at them and their industries and decided to overthrow the Hawaiian monarchy, with the help of the US. In fear of bloodshed of her own people, Queen Liliuokalani yielded her throne. Keyword here is yielded. Many historians have gathered from her own words that she thought that the US would then actually put her back in power, which the US, being the US and being manifest destiny, took that as a complete abdication. I'm going to read to you a passage from Public Law 103-150, which is basically Bill Clinton's apology. We'll get more into that in a second. I, Liliuokalani, by the grace of God and under the Constitution of the Hawaiian Kingdom, Queen, do hereby solemnly protest against any and all acts done against myself and the constitutional government of the Hawaiian Kingdom by certain persons claiming to have established a provisional government of and for this kingdom. That I yield to the superior force of the United States of America, whose minister plenipotentiary, His Excellency John L. Stevens, has caused United States troops to be landed at Honolulu and declared that he would support the provisional government, aka the colonizer turned against her. Now, to avoid any collision of armed forces and perhaps the loss of life, I do this under protest and impelled by said force yield my authority until such time as the government of the United States shall, upon facts being presented to it, undo the action of its representatives and reinstate me in the authority which I claim as a constitutional sovereign of the Hawaiian Islands. Done at Honolulu this 17th day of January, 1893. Spoiler alert, they never reinstated the Queen and they never gave the Hawaiian people their country back. Hawaii then actually became a republic run by, guess what, white planters. And again, can we stop calling these colonizer planters, because no one has ever shown me evidence that they actually plant things. They just force other people to do slave labor and plant things. But hey, Hawaii then joined the Union and became a state on August 21st, 1959. All of this was documented in the 1893 Blount Report, in which the US government admitted that they had interfered with and overthrown the Hawaiian monarchy illegally. But the 1894 Morgan Report then disputed all of that and said America did nothing wrong. And finally, the record was set straight, sort of, in 1993 by one President Bill Clinton, who decided to admit his wrongdoings. No, and I don't mean his philandering ways. I mean admitting that, yes, America did overthrow the Queen of Hawaii, and actually, Hawaii does belong to Hawaiians. But important to note that Public Law 103-150, even though it's named Public Law, is just simply an apology. A bunch of words put together that have done nothing for the Hawaiian people. Lately on Instagram, as people are starting to travel, you may have seen certain influencers going to Hawaii, showing off Hawaii, showing the lushness and paradise that is Hawaii. The opposite of that can be seen here, though, in this video.
Somewhere out there, somewhere far away, I
Gentrification is running rampant through Hawaii, causing the prices of everything from housing to milk to food to be so expensive that Native Hawaiians are being forced out of their native lands sheerly because of the cost, and also the inappropriate, rude, and racist ways that American tourists treat them. According to the United States of America, America has no colonies. America instead decided to rebrand the word colonies and call them territories. America currently has 5 inhabited territories: Guam, U.S. Virgin Islands, America Samoa, Marina Islands, and Puerto Rico. Except for American Samoa, the rest of the islands, everyone is kind of a quasi-citizen with limited constitutional rights. Yes, you heard that correctly. In American Samoa, they are solely nationals, even though it's called American Samoa and they pay American federal tax. Speaking of those limited constitutional rights, in doing my research for this segment, I was flabbergasted to find out that out of the $250,000 I paid for my very expensive law school degree, I was never taught about the insular cases. And interestingly enough, it wasn't just me. Further research showed that this Harvard Law professor, who literally teaches constitutional law at Harvard Law School, the most renowned law school in all of the United States, had never heard of the insular cases, neither in her class that she taught nor in law school when she studied. So what are the insular cases? The insular cases are about 6 cases, starting with Downs v. Biddle, that discuss and racially decided who got to be a citizen and who didn't, and still have negative impacts on the colonies of America today. Predicated on race, the insular cases sought to differentiate the inhabitants of the newly colonized territories that America had won after the Spanish-American War. So specifically, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Yes, the Philippines used to be a U.S. colony. They have since had independence since, I believe, around the 1950s. From one of the legal minds behind the insular cases that were decided in the early 1900s, it is obvious that in the annexation of outlying and distant possessions, grave questions will arise from differences of race, habits, laws, and customs of the people, and from differences of soil, climate, and production, which may require action on the part of Congress that would be quite unnecessary in the annexation of continuous territory inhabited only by people of the same race, or by scattered bodies of native Indians. A false step at this time might be fatal to the development of what Chief Justice Marshall called the American Empire. The Empire. If those possessions are inhabited by alien races differing from us in religion, customs, laws, methods of taxation, they couldn't leave out the tax. Tax is very important in America. And modes of thought, the administration of government and justice according to Anglo-Saxon principles may for a time be impossible. And the question at once arises whether large concessions ought not to be made for a time, that ultimately our own theories may be carried out, and the blessings of a free government under the Constitution be extended to them. Whew. We decline to hold that there is anything in the Constitution to forbid such action. The Constitution did literally forbid such action, to which Judge Brown didn't give an F. The Constitution only gave the federal government the power to create states, not colonies. Explicitly, not colonies, as America originally started as what? A British colony. And the founding fathers, although racist slave owners, did not want to colonize others. So they said. The court stated, there is certainly no power given by the Constitution to the federal government to establish or maintain colonies bordering on the United States or at a distance, to be ruled and governed at its own pleasure, nor to enlarge its territorial limits in any way except by admission of new states. No power is given to acquire a territory to be held and governed in a permanently colonial character. Yet in 1900, Brown and them said, well, you know what? We should interpret this differently. And a whole new secret set of cases was formed, aka the Insular cases, which is a branch of constitutional law that's not even taught in American law schools. So how did the Insular cases do this? The Insular cases went about saying that the territories which America was going to govern were unincorporated, and therefore, since they were unincorporated, they were technically not covered in the Constitution. You see the semantics, unincorporated versus incorporated. Apparently, incorporated meant that the body of land was on a pathway to statehood, such as Hawaii, versus unincorporated meant, we just gotta help these poor uncivilized people. Further, the actual present-day implication is that although Puerto Rico, Guam, and USVI are technically citizens of the United States, they have conditional constitutional law rights. Not every right granted to mainland American citizens is granted to colonized people, inhabitants of the territories. How do these insular cases affect the colonized? The native population of Guam are Chamorros. Unfortunately, the Chamorros, having survived 4,000 years on their beautiful idyllic island, have been plagued by colonization for many years. From the Spanish to the Japanese, which that was shocking to me, and then finally to the US. America actually started out as the good guy in the colonization story of Guam. During World War II, many of the Chamorros in Guam were subjected to concentration camps, brutal torture, and murder by the Japanese. Which, honestly, that's not taught in school at all. We're going to do a separate series, Colonizer Exposed Asia, because that made me see Japan in a very different light. So, during World War II, the US swept in, freed the Chamorros from the Japanese, and promised the Chamorros, hey, now you can become US citizens, everything is going to be great, but essentially turned Guam into a giant military base. Interestingly enough, though, because of the Stockholm Syndrome-esque complicated savior relationship between the United States and Guam, the Chamorros of Guam are actually more likely than mainland Americans to enroll in the American military. Home to Boricuas, Maduros, and colonization. Instead of focusing on the history of Puerto Rico, which was originally inhabited by the Taínos, which mostly became diseased and extinct due to the Spanish colonization, Puerto Rico is a tiny island nation that most mainland Americans think is a separate Caribbean country, which it's not. Puerto Ricans are indeed U.S. citizens. However, Puerto Ricans pay American federal tax. They are not allowed to vote in the American, yes, you heard that correct. Their votes do not count in the American federal elections. And Puerto Rico is plagued by rampant power outages, often 4 to 5 times that of the mainland US, and are often treated like second-class citizens. And because this clip will, a quick note, American Samoa, home to Samoans for about 4,000 years before America decided to stick its nose in their business, now plagued by, again, like the rest of the colonies, high unemployment, high rates of obesity, particularly in American Samoa. But America loves to tout that American Samoa has a great school to NFL pipeline. Lastly, not to be left out of this colonizer conversation, America has maintained its grip on essentially almost the entire world, not through colonizing 5 territories, but through the 800, yes, you're hearing this correctly, 800 plus military bases America keeps up in 70 plus countries. Yeah. And if you think that that impact is really the totality of the American military industrial complex, it's not. The real American impact, though, however, is the fact that there are an estimated 200,000 American troops stationed in 150 countries around the world. To note, there are only 195 recognized countries. From South America to the Middle East to Africa to Asia, America has systematically funded the destabilization of many countries. And while the American military wouldn't necessarily call it destabilization, they wouldn't say, what are the words? Our boys in blue fighting for freedom. Patrice Lumumba of DRC would fail to agree. America has essentially protected what they have decided to coin as freedom at its own will whenever it wants. An often forgotten story and, to be honest, outright foolish display of the American military is the 1983 Operation Urgent Fury, aka America attacking tiny Grenada. Known as the Spice Island, Grenada at the time had a population of 90,000 people. Yes, 90,000 people, as in the population of Grenada could fit into the Rose Bowl. However, undeterred by this, President Reagan was seeking a military win. As a refresher on 1980s American military history, America had just licked its wounds from basically being pushed out of Lebanon. The Lebanese were having a civil war. America wanted to come in, be the literal white knight, and the Lebanese didn't want them. So America needed a win. And where were they going to find that win? Apparently in the Spice Island. The Spice Island, a Caribbean island, is close enough to Cuba, and this is during the entire Cold War. Basically, America thought everyone was going to turn into a communist, and Cuba and Russia were going to be the ones turning everybody into a communist. And with this fear, America set its sights on Little Grenada. So what happened in Grenada? In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Grenada had some issues, as burgeoning countries do, I would like to note, and they deposed of their leader. Their leader, who was a communist, who believed in communists, but the rebels didn't think he was really for the cause enough. And America used that as a moment to sweep in and stomp out communism. Child, there's no real communism in Grenada, but that wasn't really the point. Running in tandem with that storyline, there is a medical school on the island of Grenada. American students who maybe have trouble getting into US schools go to Grenada to get their medical degree. Okay, so Ronald Reagan needed a backup plan for why he was stepping into a sovereign independent country's business, and he decided to use the medical students. The military decided that the medical students who had been seen playing volleyball and minding their business were somehow being kidnapped and in trouble. Nothing activates colonizers more than alleged white people in need. Now, with his 2 reasons: 1, they depose of their leader; 2, the American medical students need help; and 3, preventing Grenada from becoming a Cuban and Russian stronghold, Reagan and the military decided a huge giant operation was needed in Grenada. Strapped with their tourist maps, yes, I said tourist maps because America had no actual maps of Grenada because Grenada is so small and so unproblematic. That's really not the point, and clearly that wasn't the point to Reagan. They decided to storm Grenada. The military, the Navy, the Air Force. And roped in a few Caribbean countries to do it with them too. Nothing was accomplished. The American medical students, who were unharmed to begin with, continued to remain unharmed. However, multiple people died due to the sheer stupidity of the American government. Robert A. Pastor, former senior staff member of the United States National Security Council responsible for Latin America and Caribbean affairs, later reminded members of Congress in his testimony before the House Committee of Foreign Affairs of some of them. 4 members of the Navy SEALs drowned before the invasion started. One American unit called for an airstrike on another, wounding over a dozen American soldiers. American Rangers were killed and wounded when 2 helicopters collided. Spoiler alert, neither of those helicopters were Grenadians. And United States Cobra helicopters, mistaking the former Fort Matthew, then a mental hospital for Fort Frederick, destroyed it, killing between 18 and 30 inmates. Official sources admit to 18. Yes, America stormed in, blew up a literal mental institution, thus causing the bewildered inhabitants of said mental institution to run amok on the island. Couldn't make this up. But according to Ronald Reagan and the paragraph mentioned likely, maybe or maybe not in your history book, it was a victory. In closing, please email, telephone, or fax your federal, state, and local representative and ask them for an itemized receipt so we can know where the hell our taxpayer money is going.